Ciao, global students, and welcome to episode 4 of our Global Regents Review series. This section will cover two major topics: decolonization in India, basically Indian independence, and the Cold War. All of it. So here we go. Alright, so, key vocab word to know: decolonization. It's the opposite of colonization, because there's, the prefix D in front of it. So, that means we're going to start seeing colonies become independent of their European colonizer. And this mostly happens, almost entirely happens, after World War II, so post-1945. So India is really the first major country to gain independence from the British Empire in 1947, and we're going to see why right now. So first, knowing the background, officially India was under British control even by the 1700s, mid-1700s, but officially the British Empire took direct control of it after the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857, and basically the British Empire created a system of segregation in India. Indians were treated as third-class citizens, especially compared to white British people. So, you should know, the Indian nationalist political party called the INC, the Indian National Congress, two of its most famous leaders are Nehru right here, and of course, Mohandas K. Gandhi. And they have a very simple goal: make India independent of the British Empire. But also, there's the Muslim League, who also have a similar perspective, which is independence, but their issue is that they fear an independent India would be controlled by Hindus at the expense of Muslims. So that could potentially be an even worse problem. So the leader of the Muslims in the British Empire in India is Muhammad Ali Jinnah, right here. So next, you gotta know Gandhi's strategy for defeating the British Empire. And that's gonna be his strategy of civil disobedience, or I should say non-violent civil disobedience, where they identify a law they believe is unjust. For example, I don't know, being required to buy all your clothes from the British merchants. You disobey it, and you take whatever punishment is given to you, but you never fight back. You take that moral high ground. It will take a long time, but it will work. It will work. The other term you might see for civil disobedience will be boycotts, but usually it's nonviolent civil disobedience. So Gandhi's most famous movements are the homespun movement, where they're protesting British control over the cloth, the textile industry, trying to defeat that monopoly, hit the British where it hurts, which is the wallet. The Salt March, also similar to hitting him in the wallet. They're going to protest the British monopoly control over the salt production in India. And occasionally, when Gandhi believes his movement is becoming too radical, it's becoming violent in some cases, not by his own doing, he will protest his own movement by fasting to the point of almost death. So Gandhi's a pretty incredible human being for taking on the world's largest empire in a non-violent sense. Alright, so I've already mentioned these kind of in a little bit briefly, perhaps, on the last slide, but a little bit more depth here. So no, the homespun movement, the whole idea is Britain, the reason they took over India in the first place is for their cotton. So Gandhi's going to say, do not buy British clothes, burn them, and make your own clothes using the traditional method that Indians have always used, which is that hand-cranked loom that you see in this photograph right here, and eventually becomes the center of India's new flag in 1947. Salt March, I would say definitely got to know this one. Salt is such an important natural resource, and the British completely controlled it as a monopoly. So Gandhi leads a march. Well over 10,000 people joined him. They start harvesting their own salt, which was technically illegal. The British soldiers arrest them, and none of them fight back. And this march was also televised. It was photographed by journalists from around the world, and they're publishing British violence towards these non-violent resistors. And again, that moral high ground, it will work at some point in time. All right, so just after World War II, India becomes independent. 2 years after, really fast. So this was a pretty it was a peaceful means of transition. Not all transitions to independence were peaceful by any means, but in this case, it was a peaceful transfer of power. And one of the reasons that the decolonization happens after World War II is overall it actually was more expensive to maintain your colonies after World War II than it was what you're getting back from them. It was kind of like a car you constantly are dumping money into, trying to fix it. At some point, you got to get rid of it. That's the idea with a lot of European colonies, is they were just too expensive to maintain. So, right after independence, a pretty violent movement's going to occur, and it's because of that division between Hindus and Muslims in the former British Empire in India. So the decision was made, and Gandhi did not agree with it, but he had to do it because the vast majority of his own political party and also the Muslim League wanted this to be separated. So they agreed to divide or partition India into multiple countries. So India would be basically a country run by Hindus, and then West and East Pakistan will be two countries led by Muslims. And that is going to lead to a refugee crisis. So basically, if you were say a Hindu living now in West Pakistan, you probably want to move to India, which is run by Hindus. So vice versa. So there's this really the largest refugee crisis and migration crisis in human history occurred right at Indian independence. Over 10 million people are mostly walking, between India and Pakistan. And in the midst of all this, it was also pretty much a civil war. There's going to be fighting between the Hindus and the Muslims during this process, and it kills over 1 million people. So it is, unfortunately, a violent beginning to the start of both India and Pakistan. All right, so now we have topic 2, the Cold War. So we got the Cold War, basically end of World War II to 1991. So first thing, know the general definition of the Cold War. It's a long period of tension between the Soviet Union right here and the United States. And the reason it's cold is because there wasn't actually direct combat between America and the Soviet Union, although there will be wars in the Cold War, hot wars, but there wasn't actual direct fighting between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. All right, key understanding. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union is its own country, as you can see here, but it controlled all of Eastern Europe right here. And these countries in Eastern Europe, like East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, they were called satellite states because they were all communist, and they were basically puppets of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union could pretty much tell them what to do, and they're gonna do it. So yeah, they're independent technically, but the Soviet Union is calling the shots. So basically, the Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe. Sometimes you might see the term the Eastern Bloc in the Cold War, BLOC, and that means, again, Soviet control over these communist satellite states in Eastern Europe. That's the Eastern Bloc. Okay, so an element of what makes the Cold War so tense is the Soviet Union and the U.S. will have these nuclear weapons. They will become immensely destructive. They'll have hydrogen bombs that are exponentially more powerful than what was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And if one side flinches, the other side's going to respond in full force. So if one country uses their nukes, we are going to see nuclear holocaust. So that's what really makes the Cold War so scary. Another metaphor that is created out of the Cold War is Winston Churchill gives a speech in the United States. It's called his Iron Curtain speech, where he basically warns the United States that Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union have now taken over Eastern Europe, and it's America's job to kind of lead the free democratic world against the Soviet Union. So he called it an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent and divided Europe between Eastern and Western Europe, democracy and communism. All right, definitely have to know this 100%. Containment/Truman Doctrine. So before we get to that actual definition, that'll be the next slide. We got to know America's theory. America had a theory called the domino theory. If one country falls to communism, all of the other surrounding countries near it will also fall to communism, and eventually that might come all the way to the United States, as you can see in the political cartoon. So here's now the response to this domino theory. That's going to be the Truman Doctrine, also known as containment. So please remember, The Truman Doctrine is containment. Containment is the Truman Doctrine. They're the same thing, just two different terms. I think containment is probably easier to remember because it means to contain communism, but that's the same term, just so you know. So Truman makes America's foreign policy that will last well into the Vietnam War, and essentially if America sees that communism spreads to another country, say communist North Korea invades not communist South Korea, America will send in the troops to combat the spread of communism. Or in some cases, they'll just provide like economic aid or just send weapons, but it can mean sending in American soldiers if needed. All right, so really maybe the economic aspect of the containment plan is going to be the Marshall Plan. So Marshall, who was a U.S. Secretary of State after World War II, he was also a famous American general during World War II, creates America's economic foreign policy, which was America is going to give any country in Europe money to rebuild from the war if they want it. But really what the United States is doing is they understood that if you have a economy that is collapsed, or unstable in general, that they might be likely to turn to communism, as we've seen that in the 1920s. So the Marshall Plan was really actually meant to combat the spread of communism. All right, so you should know the two alliance systems of the Cold War. So the American-led alliance system was called NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the idea is collective security. There's going to be a bunch of countries in this military alliance, and if one country gets attacked, all of them have to help. So the idea is it prevents the attack in the first place. So what do you think the Soviet Union's going to do? They're going to make their own alliance system, and it will be called the Warsaw Pact. Same idea, but basically it's the Soviet Union plus all of those communist states in Eastern Europe, like East Germany, Poland, you get it. All right, Korean War. Gotta know. So, this is what we call a proxy war. A proxy is like a way of getting around something, like think of a proxy server on the internet. And the Korean War is a proxy war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Remember I said the Cold War, America and the Soviet Union never directly fight, but they find ways of kind of getting around that, as we're going to see here. So North Korea was turned communist by the Soviet Union, and South Korea was turned not communist by the United States just after World War II. Well, North Korea, led by the Kim family, invades South Korea, trying to unify all of this as one communist state. Well, what is America going to do? Containment kicks in, America sends in the troops, and is going to push the communist North Koreans all the way back, and then China is going to help the North Koreans, and basically the 3-year-long war that kills well over 1 million Koreans and about 40,000 Americans ends exactly how it started, right at this initial armistice or division line. And they agree to keep North Korea as communist, still run by the Kim family to the very day, as I say this in 2023, and South Korea as not communist, and today it is a full-fledged democracy. So the key question is, was containment successful in the Korean War? You betcha. All right, I already mentioned the nuclear arms race, idea of tension, maybe something, well, it's not new because this is review, but just know the term MAD, the idea that if one, say America uses a nuke, the Soviet Union will respond, probably even bigger, and we are all mutually assured to be destroyed. So what that does is it prevents its use. So it was actually a deterrent to never use nuclear weapons. All right, another element of kind of competition in the Cold War is the space race. Who can, put the first satellite in outer space? Who can put the first people in outer space? Who can put the first people on the moon? It's all an element of competition. Moving on. Okay, every once in a blue moon, the Regents will ask about the non-aligned movement. So the non-aligned movement is the countries who decide not to take a side during the Cold War, either being pro-US or pro-Soviet Union. They were non-aligned, perhaps neutral. So the key countries that started that movement was India, under its first Prime Minister, Nehru here. And Yugoslavia, we don't cover too much in global, but they were also key parts of the non-aligned movement. Again, every hot second they're going to ask about this, but not often, not often. All right, Berlin Wall, we should know, the physical symbol of the Cold War. So the Soviet Union constructed a wall around the democratic West Berlin to prevent any East Berliners from moving to West Berlin. And it starts in 1961, and they have like a full-fledged 12-foot wall, machine guns, barbed wire, snipers, and landmines, you name it, within about 10 years. And this division, right in Berlin, capital city of Germany, or historic capital city of Germany, I should say, is going to be the true symbol of the Cold War. When this thing collapses in 1989, November, that shows that the communist system is also collapsing. So, really key physical symbol of the Cold War. All right, so some crises in the Cold War where the world almost blows itself up. Cuban Missile Crisis is probably the most famous. That's where the Soviet Union started supplying now newly turned communist Cuba with nuclear weapons, and Cuba is like 100 miles off the coast of the Florida Keys, and that is a really short response time for the United States if they were to launch a nuclear missile at the U.S. So there's a standoff between the U.S. Navy and the Soviet ships. The Soviet Union demanded that the United States remove its missiles, nuclear missiles, out of Italy and Turkey. They believed that was kind of the same idea, and eventually they do come to a peaceful solution over this crisis. America removes its nukes from Turkey, Soviet Union removes the nukes from Cuba, and we all survive. So besides that, just note, every so often they will ask about Fidel Castro's communist revolution in Cuba, 1957, just 5 years before the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if you ever see Castro's name, think of communist revolutionary, and he eventually becomes dictator of Cuba from literally 1957 to like the early 2000s. He was there forever. Okay. Our next proxy war is the Vietnam War. Similar beginning as the Korean War, but very different end. So it starts with North Vietnam was communist, South Vietnam was not communist, and North Vietnam was led by Ho Chi Minh, a Vietnamese nationalist and communist. He invades South Vietnam. The United States containment policy kicks in. We send in the troops. We have just about 500,000 soldiers by the late 1960s in Vietnam fighting the North Vietnamese and trying to protect South Vietnam. And in 1975, there was a negotiation, an agreement between the United States, North Vietnam, and South Vietnam. The agreement was America leaves, and North Vietnam stays in North Vietnam, South Vietnam stays in South Vietnam. Well, America left, and then North Vietnam just invaded South Vietnam and took over the entire country and made it a communist country, which it still is to the very day. And our key question, did containment succeed? The answer is clearly no. Containment failed. All right. So the same year as the end of the Vietnam War, right on the neighbor of Vietnam, as you see Vietnam's right here, Cambodia is going to turn communist. So a communist political party named Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, is going to try and forcibly turn their country into a classless society of all farmers. Well, the way they did that is they targeted intellectuals, and they had a very low bar for what intellectual meant. That meant if you had like a 7th grade education, anybody who's considered a political opponent, and they were systematically murdered in these killing fields. As you can see in this photograph here, they were either worked to death or just executed. And by the end of this, like 30% of Cambodians are murdered by Pol Pot, which translates to about 2 million. And the reason the genocide ended was because actually newly communist Vietnam invaded Cambodia and pushed Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge out of Cambodia. Unfortunately, Pol Pot was never caught. So, yet again, we see another human rights abuse after the Holocaust. So, unfortunately, genocides are not going to end. Okay, so the end of the Cold War. Just some key ideas here. It's basically going to be about Soviet Union's collapse. So again, every so often they're going to ask about a part of the Cold War where it's not always really tense. And that time period is called détente, relaxation of Cold War tensions. And the best example of showing that you're, willing to talk between the United States and the Soviet Union was when they agreed to limit their arms. Basically, they deactivated some of their nuclear weapons as like an act of good faith. In reality, it didn't really mean much, but it just meant that they're willing to talk and reduce tension in the Cold War. All right, so if you're going to talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union, you got to know their last dictator, Mikhail Gorbachev, or Gorby for short. So Gorby is going to be our last dictator. Relatively young guy, at least for Soviet standards. He was like in his 50s. And he inherits a Soviet Union that had a failing economy. They weren't producing enough food. So his goal is to reform, not to destroy. Reform the Soviet Union. Make it last. Well, here's how he's going to do it. Reform number 1 is his economic reform, and you should know the Russian word perestroika. And basically what he's going to do is he is going to maintain an overall communist system, but allow some capitalism. He understands that capitalism allows, like, it forces people to produce more because they can make a profit. So he's allowing, like, if you say you own a shoe shop, you can now actually make a profit off of your shoes. But basically, the big stuff stays under government control, communist control. But the smaller stuff, you can have private businesses. So he's trying to mix the two. Unfortunately, when he's abandoning these ideas of, like, everybody has a job, he abandons the idea of everybody has healthcare in the Soviet Union. That is going to start now actually increasing the speed of the decline of the Soviet Union. So, unfortunately, this system actually made the food shortages worse. It led to an inflation of the Soviet currency, the ruble. So, even though he tried to fix the Soviet Union, this economic reform of perestroika is actually going to hasten its collapse. And then he's going to try and make political reforms. In this case, glasnost, political openness, transparency. So for literally the first time in Russian history, he's going to allow Soviet citizens to criticize the government, actually talk about their true political feelings in public and not fear arrest by the secret police. So, in theory, this is not a bad idea, but what this does is if you had over about 100 years of repression, people are going to take this and run with it. So now you have some Soviets and also countries like Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, who are those satellite communist states, they want democracy. So glasnost basically opens up the floodgates for the calls of creating a democracy in the Soviet Union and also the rest of Eastern Europe. So what he unintentionally does is he's going to dramatically increase the rise of nationalism in, like, Poland, East Germany, Hungary, like I just said, because they want independence. And additionally, he just passed a law where no longer is the Communist Party the only accepted political party in the Soviet Union. So now there's actually going to be competitive elections? What? Yeah, that's democracy, folks. Competitive elections. So, we then get to the symbolic beginning of the collapse of the communist system, which is the fall of the Berlin Wall. Soviet Union says they will no longer enforce the borders in Eastern Europe, especially in East Germany. And the Berlin Wall begins to be destroyed. And that starts on November 9th, 1989. And the Soviet Union will cease to exist 2 years later. Okay. So, December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev goes on television and says, tomorrow, December 26th, the Soviet Union will cease to exist. And at that point, the Soviet Union collapses. It becomes the Russian Federation, which is still the name of Russia today, and they hold their very first democratic elections, where they elect this lovely gentleman who, as we talked about, was usually drunk more than he was sober. All right. That is episode 4. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for episode 5. See you later.